Focus on Abilities is brought to you by Tier Memorial Hermann, redefining rehabilitation, removing barriers, re-enabling independence. In the ILRU Southwest ADA Center, promoting compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Welcome to our program today. I'm Lex Frieden, your host. I'm professor at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston, and I direct the Southwest ADA program at Tier Memorial Hermann. We have a very interesting interview today, and I'm happy to be here at the George Bush Presidential Library and Museum with the director, Warren Finch. Warren, thanks for being on our program today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Now, Warren, your job as director means you're responsible for this whole enterprise, right?
Right. We're a little bit of a hybrid institution here. We have an archive and a museum. So I'm kind of in charge of the archives and the archive program, and also our museum and exhibits programs.
You say that's hybrid. Is that typical of all the presidential libraries?
It's typical of all the presidential libraries, but it's unique in NAR. The National Archives in Washington, D.C. has exhibit space, but most NAR facilities, with the exception of the presidential libraries, don't have exhibit space, so we're a little unique in that aspect.
Okay, so if you were going to the National Archives, most people think of the Washington, D.C. Building, right, where the Constitution, right, Declaration of Independence, and so on. In addition to that, the other display space, or the museums, right, are at the presidential libraries.
Right, they do have exhibit space at the National Archives building, but we have other facilities scattered throughout the U.S., what we call record centers, which where the records, most of the records of the federal government is stored, and for the most part, they do not have exhibit space. No.
So the National Archives, most people do think of it as the Constitution, but in fact, the agency is responsible for storing all public records?
Well, our agency was set up to preserve and make available the records that the U.S. government creates. And we also provide records management. So there are a lot of records that the government creates that don't have long-term permanent historical value. And so we keep those in big record centers for short-term value, or short-term, and then we have schedules. Of course, it gets very complicated. And at the end of those schedules, those records are disposed of, and then the records that have long-term historic value are kept. And in the U.S., we make those records available to the public. That's part of our democracy, and that's our core mission.
Now, the presidential libraries, how many are there?
We have a presidential library for every president from Herbert Hoover all the way through George W. Bush in Dallas, 13 or 14, I lose count. And they're located all throughout the country, from everywhere from West Branch, Iowa, that's where Hoover was born, to there's 2 out in California, 3 here in Texas. There's the Roosevelt Library in New York. They're, basically from sea to shining sea.
And the presidents themselves decide where their library will be, or is that a negotiated kind of decision? How's that work?
Well, historically, the president has always decided where he wanted his presidential library to be. The first one was the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York, and Roosevelt it's actually on his estate. So the presidential library is on the same grounds as his home, and that library is built and opened while President Roosevelt was still alive, and the architectural drawings for the building are his own.
Wow.
So it's rather unique. It was the first, and then President Hoover, who was still alive in the late 1950s, decided he wanted a presidential library, and so he created one and put his in his birthplace. So it's the earliest, but the Roosevelt Library is the first.
And the George Bush Presidential Library was determined to be here at College Station by President Bush after he was president, or while he was president?
While he was president. Actually, President Bush chose very early. I think of all the presidents who were in office, he chose earliest to put it was his, in his second year of his presidency, he chose Texas A&M. He had been a congressman from Houston. His congressional district was just south of here. He had been here several times. He'd given some speeches here. He gave the commencement address the first year he was president here at Texas A&M. He loved the student body. The faculty, the staff, and the university was very enthusiastic for having it here. And in the second year of his presidency, he chose Texas A&M. And,
well, he also employed the president of Texas A&M or the chancellor in an important capacity in Washington while he was the president.
Well, the archivist, the gentleman who was the archivist of the United States, Don Wilson, at the time, became the foundation director of the Bush Foundation after President Bush left office.
Okay.
And he kind of started the fundraising program and selecting the contractors and getting the building built and all that.
I think that's probably also another point people would be interested in. The libraries and museums are built with contributed funds, right?
Correct. So when these libraries were set up, after it became, there were 2 or 3 of them, and it became a tradition, as we say here at Texas A&M. There was a mechanism, a foundation set up, which raises all the money. And then, so the library, the museum, the exhibits, everything were paid for through donated funds. And then the day the library opens, the library is given to the government as a gift by the foundation. And then we still generate some income on our own. We charge admission to the museum. That admission to the museum goes back into the operation of the building. And then the foundation still operates, and the foundation provides all of our funding for education programs, exhibits, and all of our public and programs. So everything we do outside of making the documents available to the public is either paid through funds we generate from the missions or through our foundation, our very generous foundation.
And the National Archives Agency provides the infrastructure for servicing the facilities and the
Correct.
staff and so on.
So the National Archives provides staff. We're all government employees, and it also provides the heating, the air conditioning. There's a small revenue generated through an endowment that helps defray some of that cost, but the government pays most of those salaries and the infrastructure. You're correct.
What's unique about the George Bush Presidential Library and Museum, besides the fact that it commemorates the presidency of George Bush?
Well, it's only now one of 3 presidential libraries located on a college campus. The Johnson Library over in Austin, ours, and then the new George W. Library at SMU. It includes 3 buildings, so we're kind of like the 3 amigos. The library and museum, and then there's the George Bush Foundation, which also puts on programs. You were here for the 25th anniversary of the Bush administration. They put on that program. And then there's the George Bush School of Government and Public Service, which is the 3rd part of this campus. And they're basically training students to go out and do public service. So their students go out and get jobs with nonprofits. They become city managers and go into public service jobs. So it's a 2-year program, considered one of the best public service schools in the country.
Warren, your leadership here is evident. Thank you so much for helping preserve the history
Well, thank you.
of the
Thank you.
ADA, and we appreciate the opportunity.
Well, we appreciate all your papers and your artifacts. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for watching. We'll be back with more later. We're at the George Bush Presidential Library and Museum, and we're here with the Director of Education, Dr. Shirley Hammond. Shirley, thank you for being on the program today.
It's a pleasure.
Shirley, Director of Education, do you teach classes here? What do you do?
We have a variety of programs that we do here. Some are on site, so students are able to come to our classroom that we have in the museum. And we have a team of education docents. We have around 40 education docents who are the instructional leaders in the classroom. We have programs for the Americans with Disabilities Act that they're able to do in our classroom. So we also do a large number of distance learning programs. And we're able to, in that way, actually we have gone globally in our distance learning programs. The most popular program is with former First Lady Barbara Bush. It's called Reading Discovery, and we have literally gone around the world with her. and been connected to students in Ghana, West Africa who've asked her questions,
Wow.
and also France and Canada. So we like to help students understand President Bush's contribution to American history. And it's very important for them to study the primary sources of the administration. And so especially in teaching them about the Americans with Disabilities Act.
What would be a primary source as it relates to the ADA?
Mm-hmm. As it relates to the ADA, a primary source would be photos. There are audio visuals, for instance, a photo on the South Lawn on July 26, 1990, showing everyone. But also we do have the video available of his remarks. And that's an important learning source because we can have the students think about questions that they need to respond to at the end of it. And also they need to develop their own questions and answers so that they're doing critical thinking when they are considering the remarks by President Bush and what the impact on society is then of the ADA. And we have an incredible treasure of documents in our Bush archives. And so we have many letters. And these are letters from people written to President Bush which were advocating for the passage of the ADA.
You told me that you found a letter from Stephanie Thomas, who's an advocate who works with a group called ADAPT. And Stephanie lives with her husband, Bob Kafka, in Austin. Mm-hmm. Is this a recent letter that Stephanie sent to you about the president, or where did the letter come from?
So she mailed the letter to President Bush in March of 1989 because she was advocating for the passage of the ADA. And in that, she has a wonderful sentence in which she says, access is the key to our civil rights. And so she emphasized the importance of access, which really is the intent of the ADA, for our disabled Americans to have access to the opportunities in American society.
But Shirley, I don't think most people believe that if they write a letter to the President of the United States, that person, he or she, will ever see it. And they certainly, I think Stephanie Thomas will be surprised to learn that she could come here and find her letter in the Bush Presidential Library.
Yes, it's part of our lesson plan, and it's online, in fact.
And another letter you told me about is from a woman from the independent living movement named Kathy Ewell. Kathy's letter was similar to Stephanie's?
Yes, Kathy's letter focused on the issue of the importance of transportation. And she sent it after the Court of Appeals in February had said that it was important to have transportation available to people who are disabled, that was a right of theirs. And so she sent, because they were very worried that possibly there would be an appeal made by some group who did not understand the vital importance of this issue. Transportation was one of the key aspects under public services of the ADA, Title II. And so she was saying transportation is the lifeline to our lives as disabled Americans. You know, we can't go anywhere without bus transportation, like to church, to schools, shopping. And so her advocacy was very important about Title II of the ADA and transportation's importance.
And again, I mean, it is kind of amazing to me that these letters have survived for 25 years, but I guess since they're in the archives, we might find them there 150 years from now.
We assure you, that is our job, to preserve those letters and to provide access to the public so that they can come and read them. And of course, for students to use primary sources to touch those voices, as I said, then they really have a better understanding. They are touching history. They are, in fact, connecting with why people felt so strongly about this. And the success of the ADA is that the young students have no idea about what society was like before the ADA.
Well, I think that's probably why it's so important that you're providing education, that we all are trying to help young people understand some of the struggles that folks had before the ADA and some of the changes that occurred as a result of it.
Yes.
Shirley, you emphasize primary sources, and by that you mean people should actually read the letters. They should read the documents, the reports, the memos that were done to and by the president around these subjects, rather than depend on some secondary summary that might be found on Wikipedia or another website.
Absolutely. And so we also have all of his speeches, and the speeches are interesting for students to see because frequently there are notations in the margins by President Bush. And of course the speech writing process is involved. Many people help with these speeches, you know, in the drafting of them. And so it's an interesting process itself for the students to learn about.
Well, I think you helped me find a particular speech. After, when President Bush was actually Vice President Bush, he made a speech to the National Council on Independent Living in Washington, D.C. And we had lost the copy of that speech. We didn't have any record of the speech. We didn't have any video, audio, or anything. But some of us advocates remembered that speech, and we recall it as being significant. And you were able to find that in the archives, along with notes, speaking notes that President Bush had in the margin. That was just marvelous, and it shows you the value of having a resource like this.
Right, and we're so glad that they're being used, that others understand the value of reaching out to those primary sources and sharing them.
Shirley, thanks so much for being our guest here today. It's been wonderful to visit with you, and I look forward to working with you going forward.
It's a great honor to work with you. Thank you so much, and God bless.
We'll be back after a break. I'm happy right now to introduce to you Dr. Robert Holzweiss. Dr. Holzweiss is the archivist at the George Bush Presidential Library and Museum, which has a substantial archival collection. Dr. Holzweiss, you are the archivist. What is that exactly?
Thank you very much, Dr. Frieden. I am the supervisor of the archives here. We have a staff of 15 people that make the documents of the Bush administration and the Bush vice presidency available for research in our research room. There's no cost to do that. It's a service that we provide to the people of the United States.
So I had the opportunity yesterday to see rows and rows and rows of shelves with neatly organized boxes of papers. And how many documents are there?
We have about 41 million pages, and it only coincidentally coincides with the 41st President of the United States. We didn't plan it that way, although it worked out that way. About 36 million of those pages are what we call official presidential documents. That is, they are property of the government of the United States, and we make them available under the Freedom of Information Act. The balance of those documents, about 5 or 6 million pages, are donated materials. And yesterday you were kind enough to donate your records to us for the Americans with Disabilities Act, and prior to that. And that will made up with the official government records on the Americans with Disabilities Act from the Bush administration. And your records will enhance the research experience that the researcher has when they come and review the government records.
So we say this is a library and museum. In one sense, it's not a typical library. You wouldn't come here necessarily to check books out, take them home, read them, and return them. It's not a lending library in that sense of the word, is it?
That's correct. The short story is that Franklin Roosevelt established the presidential library system while he was still president, and the documents, the official government documents, were needed in Washington, D.C., so the original library was his library at Hyde Park, New York, and at the time that was a library with books and how we would traditionally understand a library. Since then, the library system has morphed into an archival repository. We do have some books, but we do not participate in interlibrary loan, They're only available for use in our research room, and there's a very small collection. They're only designed to supplement your archival research experience.
And not all libraries have archives. I guess all presidential libraries must, but if one's thinking about our community library, it doesn't necessarily have archives.
Not necessarily. Many community libraries will collect documents from local politicians, local business leaders, civic leaders that they find to be important, that are telling the story of their community. And one of the things we try to do here is obviously tell the story of President Bush, but we also are trying to explain the life and times of President Bush and get a little more broad look at American society. And that, again, is why donated records like the ADA records are so important, because it moves beyond what was going on in Washington, D.C. and Congress and the presidency and looks at broader trends within American society.
Now, the artifacts and papers that one might see if they came here to visit the museum, are all owned by the archives? Are they all part of the archives here, or how does that work?
Well, all the documents are owned by the government of the United States, and donated materials are given or deeded over to the government of the United States. The official public records belong to the people of the United States, thanks to the Presidential Records Act. We have some latitude with the Act when we do a review of the papers. We release most things, but some things are the property of the president, and we clearly identify that when we show you the records in the research room.
But a lot of the exhibits actually are made up of materials that you provide from the archive.
Oh, absolutely. We don't provide original documents for display, except on rare occasions, because light damages documents, and we've learned that the hard way, unfortunately. So most of the documents you'll see in the museum are facsimiles, and they're identified as such. But we found that telling the story is best done by looking at the original documents. So when we put together an exhibit on, let's say, the ADA next year when we have the 25th anniversary, we will feature a lot of original documents in there and let people draw the lines between them themselves and experience the documents as the authors experience the documents.
As an historian, do you feel like there's a good set of material that actually records President Bush's role with respect to the ADA?
Absolutely. We have about 60,000 pages of material. Now, some of that's duplicated across the collection, obviously, because the photocopier was used extensively in the White House and still is. But the bulk of the material deals with the legal issues. And if you're a scholar of legal history, we have you covered. The personal issues are there, people writing in, telling their personal stories about experience with discrimination or with the successes of the ADA after it was passed. But generally speaking, you'll have to go to the donated collections to get more of the backstory and the personal side of the law.
But you were kind enough yesterday to share with me some books, some scrapbooks, that were actually gifts to the president while he was president.
Yep.
I never expected to see these again. I actually was honored to present him with one of those scrapbooks the year after the ADA, on the first anniversary of the ADA. And I never expected to see that again. I'm not sure that I expected it to be on the president's personal bookshelf, but I just assumed at some point those kinds of things get lost.
Well, they do, but that's a rare occasion. The president and the vice president, when he was serving as vice president, have a staff called the gift unit. And anything that comes into the White House that they receive anonymously or without asking for it, and things they receive through face-to-face donations like you made, are carefully cataloged and inventoried and stored until the presidential library comes online. We have about 120,000 individual objects, some as large as paintings that'll cover an entire wall, many as small as buttons, campaign memorabilia, and then of course we have a book collection of which your book that you donated was a part.
I see. Another thing that, I mean, this is just kind of a wild question, but on the 15th anniversary of the ADA, President George W. Bush at the time invited me and a few friends to the White House to celebrate, and George H.W. Bush, our George Bush here, was present at the same time. We were surprised. We met two presidents, Bush, at the same time, and I had our photos taken with them. The ADA was, from an historian standpoint, now acknowledged as being one of the most significant pieces of legislation, domestic legislations, ever passed. It has been likened to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because it actually affected at the time more than 40 million people and now more. The ADA, from your perspective, how do you think President Bush actually felt about it? I mean, does the record indicate that he was...
Yes. The president obviously was very passionate about the cause, and you know that from your interaction with him when he was vice president and his interest in the issue. So I don't think it was a surprise when he adopted it as a major part of his domestic agenda during the presidency. And the documents, the government documents, will speak to his own personal engagement and involvement in the process of negotiating with Congress, getting a piece of legislation that he supported, and he could enthusiastically go out and sign with a very public signing ceremony, and go out on the hustings and promote and say, look what we've done, and look at how it's affecting the individual lives of people in the United States. So yes, I think he is was very much engaged, and he's very proud of what he accomplished with that piece of legislation.
Thanks so much for taking the time to be here today. I know you have a busy task cataloging 41 million records and more than 100,000 artifacts.
Yes, yes, sir.
Appreciate all of you watching. Thank you very much to Dr. Robert Holschweiss, who's the archivist of the George Bush Library and Museum. Please join us next time for more on this program, Focus on Abilities.
Focus on Abilities is brought to you by Tier Memorial Hermann, redefining rehabilitation, removing barriers, re-enabling independence. In the ILRU Southwest ADA Center, promoting compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act.